Great. Okay, that's perfect. Okay, thank you, everyone. Sorry about that technical point there. As I was saying, Jason is the editor for our Ideas in Action, and he is the author of Activities for Cooperative Learning, as well as several other titles in the Delta series and outside the Delta series. So I will now hand over to Jason. If you've got any questions, please type them into the text chat. If you do have any problems with hearing, the audio seems to be fine at the moment. If you just log out and then log back in again, okay? But any questions, just pop it into the text chat for Jason. Okay, over to you, Jason.
Thank you very much, Martin. Great. So first check, can everyone hear me okay? Great. So if you can't hear me, it might be an issue at your end. Okay. So welcome. It's lovely to see so many people today. I hope everything is going well for everyone around the world, and I'm feeling for all my colleagues in Italy and other parts of the world where there are some challenges with the current coronavirus situation. So welcome to this webinar. I've called it Principles and Practices of Cooperative Learning. A theme which I've been interested in now for quite a few years. And the book which I wrote is a product of my research into it and some activities which I came up with. So before we move on any further, let's just find out, first of all, I think we've kind of established where you're from, but let's just do that again for fun's sake. Bit of typing practice for you. Share with us, please, which country you're working in so we can all see each other's contexts. I think we've got lots of people from Italy, haven't we? Welcome, quite a few from Germany, lovely to see you. Madrid, Russia, San Marino. Never been to San Marino, I'd love to do a workshop there. Austria, fantastic. I was in Austria a couple of years ago, had a wonderful time there, amazing schools. Netherlands, Germany again, Italy, great. We don't see many colleagues from the Netherlands, actually. I think you guys all speak English so well. You don't need to study it. Brilliant, welcome, wow, so lots. C'è molta gente da Italia. I lived and worked in Italy for 2 wonderful years in the beautiful town of Sassari in Sardinia. Some wonderful memories of bird watching in that area. Okay, so next question. Sorry, I'm getting carried away. How many years of teaching experience do you have? Let's just put a number in the box. Just hit that number pad. 19, 20, 31. Wow. 35, I think we saw there. Who can win? 6. So we haven't got any novices here. That's interesting to see. No brand new teachers, at least according to what you're saying there. Great. Okay. 4. Okay, 4 is the least actually. That's still pretty good experience. 1 from India. 1 year experience from Chanki Kumar. Brilliant. Okay. Oh, I see you were answering question number 1, Chanki Kumar, weren't you? So question number 3. What's your main teaching context? By which I mean, what level do you teach at? Primary, younger learners, secondary and teens, or tertiary and adults? So we've got, okay, lots of secondary. Adults, yeah. Mainly secondary and adults, 1 teen there. Lots of Bs, great, that's secondary. Primary and secondary, some of you working at both levels. Secondary low level from Emanuela, thank you for that. And a few more upper adults as well, great, okay. And last question, sorry to ask such a kind of a fundamental question, but it's always interesting to see a few answers if we can see them fly by. Why did you come to this webinar? Is it just that you've been restricted in your current work and movements for reasons that we probably all know of? The topic, great. Open to new ideas. Want to learn new approaches. This isn't a new approach, but we can definitely learn from it, I think. Some people love webinars. Wow, fantastic. Objective and improvement from Alessia, thank you. More about this topic, professional development. Cooperative learning, great. So that's Stefania's a kind of hope there. I hope that we can meet that one. Lifelong learners, great, that's brilliant. I try to be. As I'm getting older, it's more difficult to learn new ideas. Delta publishing books, well, hey, great. Okay, so let us move on. Let's move on first of all with a word of caution. I've been doing this more and more recently. As I work around the world, I noticed that there are so many different contexts for teaching and learning. We've only established 4 kind of basic parameters there, but there are so many more. So I think it's important always to be critical. when you attend something like a webinar, which is from somebody often in a different country, different part of the world, telling you their ideas about how you could do something in your own classroom, always be critical, always ask questions like, will these ideas be relevant? Will these ideas be feasible? A lot of us have got overloaded curricula, pressures on us in terms of what we have to teach, and we always need to work out ways to make sure that what somebody else is suggesting we do in our classroom fits with what everybody around us believes we should be doing, and whether we can fit it into our curriculum and our context. So a very obvious point there, but always be critical about the ideas that you get from webinars like this. Okay, so let's move on to a few aims. One of you mentioned there to better understand cooperative learning. I think it was Stefania. So hopefully in this webinar, that'll be the main kind of focus. We will reflect on and develop our understanding, including me, of what cooperative learning is and the theory of learning behind it. We'll become familiar with a range of cooperative learning activities and strategies, quite a few coming from my book, Activities from Cooperative Learning, and we'll also do a bit of the sciencey stuff to look at some of the research evidence supporting it. Olga, your camera has just come on there. I don't know if you can switch it off. That's great, thank you. Great, okay. So there we go. So let's start off with a question. There's going to be lots of questions in this webinar, by the way, so hopefully I'll get you involved and interested. Oh, hang on, we've got somebody there from DLC. Difference between collaborative and cooperative. Wow, that's incredible because you've read my mind. This is like almost like that TV show QI, isn't it? That was the next question I was going to ask. That's spooky, isn't it? So the first question is, in your opinion, because this is a matter of opinion, I suppose, do cooperative learning and collaborative learning mean the same thing? Hi and no. Hi, Paula. Lorenzo says no. Laura says, I think so. Feel free to add a bit more if you can. Often it's the last comment that we read the most. So if you take your time, they sound the same, but maybe they're not. Yeah, I would say that. Going with a yes. Thank you, Kate. They can be confused. Yes, I think they definitely can. They can be seen as synonymous, definitely. Yeah. Overlap. Not sure. Great. We'll clarify that up for you, Elena. Necessarily. Can be collaborative, but not cooperative. Hello, Diana. Don't worry. Come and join us. We've only just started. We've got the first question here. So not necessarily, yeah. We'll soon find out. Hopefully we will, Antonio. Thank you for that. Great. Okay, so here's my opinion on this question. Having done a lot of research, we can say that both of these, cooperative and collaborative learning, first of all as terms, we're essentially defining terminology here. They're both underpinned by a belief that learners can and should learn from each other, not just the teacher. So the cooperation here in both of these approaches to learning is cooperation between learners in the classroom, as you can see in this picture of a group of teachers actually that I worked with in China, and we were looking at cooperative learning a year or two ago. So both of them essentially have this key element to them, this belief that learner-learner interaction, rather than interacting with the teacher, can and should be included in the classroom and can and should help learning. But there are important differences. The term collaboration or collaborative learning tends to focus simply on what we sometimes call the interaction pattern, so that they simply refer to how we do an activity. If you do an activity in pairs or in groups, then the students are working collaboratively. And the opposite, if you like, to collaborative learning is individual work. So collaborative learning includes every activity type or every interaction pattern in the classroom where learners work collaboratively. And most classes, I think, especially most language teaching classrooms, will have a combination of collaborative learning and then sometimes individual learning, what we sometimes also call seat work in mainstream education, and sometimes some whole class teaching where the teacher takes the front as well. So that's basically collaboration, and it's, oh, grazie, your camera has come on. If you can switch that off, that would be great. Grazie consiglio, if you can. Thank you. Switch off your camera. That's brilliant. Thank you, Grazia. Collaboration and collaborative learning refer to how we might do the activity. So there isn't necessarily a solid theory underpinning that. And people draw theories in when they talk about it, but it can be pretty much a random event as to which theories of learning they draw upon. Things like constructivism come up, learner-centered approaches, and collaborative and communicative language teaching is often thrown in there. But cooperative learning is actually something much more specific. Cooperative learning was an important methodological movement in mainstream education. It has historical roots, principles in mainstream psychology, and extensive research evidence supporting it. And that's what the focus of this talk is going to be, and also its relevance for us as language teachers. And even if you're not a language teacher, for example, if you're a CLIL teacher teaching a different subject through English, then hopefully this will be useful for you as well. So that's the first question hopefully dealt with. So just to clarify then, there's a lot of overlap between them, as some of you said. I'd agree with that. One of them is simply a description of how learners are interacting in the classroom. If you take a photograph, you can often see if learners are working individually or collaboratively. And the other one is a specific approach, a principle, with research and also with a lot of theory underpinning it. And we'll look at that theory in a moment. So next question, where does cooperative learning come from? If I'm saying it's a specific approach, any ideas? Where does it come from? Where in the world and when did it evolve? I may have actually said that already. I wasn't really monitoring how much I was saying. Civil rights movement, yes, in a way. Yeah, kind of in a slightly indirectly, but yeah. Spain, American research, business, USA. Yeah, actually, Ignacia, there is a link to business there, which I'll elaborate on. Yeah. It does indeed. So thank you, Gabriela and Anarita. It comes from the USA. And as Heike says, there is an important link to psychology, which I'll mention now. It doesn't really originate in the UK, interestingly enough. So there we go. Let's have a look at a brief history of cooperative learning. Well, it evolved in mainstream education in the USA, as several of you said, and it reached a peak of popularity in the late 1980s and early 1990s. It continues to be popular, but since then, a lot of kind of measures have come in mainstream education in America that makes it more difficult for some teachers to continue to employ cooperative approaches. It doesn't necessarily come from, I just seen Heike's comment there, animal behavior. I wouldn't agree with that. In terms of the important influence in psychology, two American psychologists, Kurt Levine and Morton Deutsch, were working mainly in work environments, and they were researching questions like, do work environments work more cooperative? Sorry, do work environments, are they more effective when colleagues work cooperatively or when they work competitively? So they were comparing competition in the workplace with cooperation, and they found, as many of us would probably expect as teachers, that in fact working cooperatively was a far more effective way, not just in terms of creating a better sense of well-being for the participants in the workplace, but also in terms of getting work done. It became more productive. About that time in the late 1960s, in fact, Levine and Deutsch were a little bit before that, and the early 1970s, a number of psychologists who are working more in educational contexts, including the Johnson brothers and a gentleman called Elliot Aronson in Texas. These people were looking at some problems that they were noticing happening in classrooms as a result of a specific phenomenon that was happening in America at the time called desegregation. Now, desegregation was when in America, especially in the South, schools or classrooms where black kids and white kids had previously been educated separately in a segregated apartheid type system, they were being brought together. And this was causing all kinds of challenges in the classroom. There were conflicts in terms of conflicts between the kids, between the parents. There were challenges because of the different backgrounds and the different schools that they'd come from, and also because of the learners' level of prior privilege and disadvantage. And a lot of these writers began to experiment with ways to get these kids to work together more effectively. So cooperative learning kind of became a solution to a problem of what we sometimes call heterogeneous classes. And by heterogeneous, I mean mixed ability, but also mixed in other ways, such as mixes of girls and boys, gender, mixes of race, mixes of ability. Sorry, I've said that. and all those kind of things. And also in our language classrooms, for many of us, there may also be a wider mix of languages in the classroom or even dialects. So there we go. Cooperative learning originates in that specific time and place, and it's a methodology which is designed to help learners to work together more effectively. And one of the interesting things is that that makes it useful and important for pretty much all of us, because there are very few of us who are not facing some of these challenges. So there we go. Cooperative learning does, of course, employ and make use of pair work and group work extensively, and it isn't just about that, but these are definitely features. So cooperative learning uses collaborative learning. So the next question I'd like to ask you is to share with us, and this, you may need a few moments to think of some ideas and to write them down. What kind of problems do you have when you try doing group work and pair work in your own classrooms? Discipline, Kate says. Kate, I wonder what are you working at secondary level? Noise, Paula. Paula, how big are your classes? Class management, yeah. Passive, yes. Now, dominant versus submissive passive behavior. Heike, we'll look at that. You can't monitor everyone all the time. Yeah. They turn into native language, and that's an interesting one that I can address now as well. Pair work is definitely easier for some of us, definitely. Yeah. Some students work, others don't. And this is a really common one that we see, especially at secondary level. What we tend to find is that at secondary level, if we get learners to work collaboratively, we often find that one or two students dominate the interaction and other students don't. Different motivation levels, not everyone's inclusion. This problem keeps coming up again and again. Speaking the mother tongue. These are the two kind of main things. Monitoring assessment becomes difficult. It absolutely does, yeah. Some students are lazy, others active. Students speaking Italian, ma è una lingua molto bella, so così. Students like it, but think it's an easy activity. Okay, yeah. Group work has to be very well organized. Yeah, exactly. And that organization point, I think, is something that we will look at very carefully towards the end of this webinar, because cooperative learning has some quite prescriptive suggestions for how group work should be organized. And instructions have to be clear, absolutely, yeah. So let's deal first of all with one of those that isn't really a focus of this webinar, but I'll be interested to know your opinions because I'm going to give you mine. And this question of learners using the L1 or the mother tongue. For those of you working in contexts where there is just one language shared amongst the learners, then often what happens is the learners will simply, when you give them an activity that they enjoy doing, they will simply begin using that language. And one thing I want to say is that, especially with kids, that is a very natural and a very normal thing to do. It means, to some extent, you've engaged them, you've got them involved in the activity. And even if they aren't necessarily speaking English, if they've got a text that's in English, or they're expected to write something in English, don't forget that all of that conversation in the mother tongue or in another language is often conversation about English and about how they can use English. So don't necessarily underestimate that use of the L1 as being a negative thing. I'm a very strong believer in the fact that we can not only use the L1 in the classroom, but it's a tool which helps the learners themselves to learn. And one thing that I've seen in my own experience is even at teenage levels, as and when learners become more comfortable with the language you're teaching, in our case that's English for most of us, then they will naturally often begin to adopt English and even to blend elements of English into their own use of the mother tongue, whether that be Italian or German, what we call translanguaging. This blending of languages can be a useful bridge from that support of the mother tongue where they're confident in their peer group towards using more English in the classroom. Thank you, Fernando. Yeah, so I wouldn't say it's about necessarily about allowance, it's about understanding. If they're using L1, notice how they're using it, draw upon that, and praise them as well when they start to employ more use of English. But remember, that use of L1 is often dictated by the peer group. I remember when I was studying French at school, the only time I produced a word of French was when the teacher was staring at me and telling me, Anderson, speak French. So yeah, cool. Anyway, that's not really what this webinar is about, interestingly. Well, maybe not interestingly if I'm going off point. So yeah, let's now move on to possibly the most commonly mentioned issue there, that is the one that this webinar will look at. This situation where when you get the learners working in groups especially, and even sometimes in pairs, what you find is that some students are dominant and some students are passive. And this is something which cooperative learning attempts to address through two key principles. If you read the main writers of cooperative learning, these are people like the Johnson brothers, Spencer Kagan, Robert Slavin, and Elliot Aronson. They often share they often talk about a large number of principles, but if you distill it down, there's two key principles that you can also find in the work of Deutsch and Levine. And these are the principles of positive interdependence and individual accountability. So the first of those, positive interdependence, states that for an activity to be truly cooperative, the learners must work as a team, not in competition with each other. Although inter-team competition is recognized by some of the authors on cooperative learning. At primary level, inter-team competition can even be stressful, but at secondary and adult levels, it's usually a healthy way to motivate the learners. And it can be a way to motivate them to use English, for example, if you give points for use of English when they're doing the group work as well. But yeah, so just to state that point again, the activity needs to require them to work together, to work as a team. That's a fairly obvious point, but it's one that needs to be stated. The second one is more tricky, and it's often lost. It's often forgotten in language teaching, individual accountability. So for an activity to be truly cooperative, the group success will depend on contributions from all the group members, making each learner accountable for their own learning and the success of the group. And to put that in a very simple example, the typical situation way that we make that happen is to make sure that for the group to succeed, each learner must contribute something to the product of the group work activity. So there we go. Those are the two key principles which cooperative learning, which you find among the writers in cooperative learning. And why are these principles important? Well, the first one and the main one is this very important point that if you don't use both of these principles, you tend to get situations where either the learners become competitive and sometimes they can lose focus in terms of whether it be language use or whether it be focusing on the product of what they're trying to come up with, but also that some of the learners get less involved, they take a back seat, they fall out of the activity, and essentially for those students, it can be a waste of time, a waste of energy, or even counterproductive. Just looking at some of your comments there. Yeah, different levels of ambition, and that's something which is, I suppose, a factor which influences motivation as well among the learners. Very important in agency. And yes, more than two elements. Daniela, we'll come on to some ideas from cooperative learning about how the groups can come together. Now, let's have a quick look at a couple of pictures. So here are two activities that when we were in China recently, we got teachers doing in a workshop on cooperative learning. If you look at the picture on the left, you can see a situation where the learners are doing some activity on the table. And it's a fairly typical one that many of us recognize. It looks to us like one of those people, in fact, she wasn't. But the photo, let's talk about the story in the photo. In the photo story, one or two students were quite dominant. They were taking the control. And other students, such as the girl in the pink shirt, were kind of taking a back seat. So this first activity, they may have been working together, and the activity, they had to rank certain qualities in order. It involves positive interdependence, but it doesn't involve individual accountability, because in order for the participants to succeed in the activity, that girl in the pink shirt doesn't necessarily need to contribute anything. So the lack of individual accountability can sometimes lead to some students taking a back seat. And I'm not sure if any of you have mentioned the point, but that may sometimes not be a bad thing. Some students, we've all got individual personalities, and some of us seem to learn, including learning languages, more from being more passive and picking up ideas from others, and others tend to learn from taking risks and being more proactive. But nonetheless, that activity on the left is less likely to meet the two key principles of cooperative learning. Have a look at the picture on the right, and this is something which we do with adult classes a lot. I'm not sure if this is so feasible in secondary classrooms, especially large secondary classrooms. We have some colleagues here from India, and having worked there recently, it can be a real challenge in some of the larger classrooms. But it's called a mingle activity, where you get learners up and standing and talking to each other. And you can see there are two girls there who seem to be interacting and discussing well. And one, I think, important point there. Oh, Emanuela, I think your camera has just come on. If you can switch that off. Right, thank you. And in order for these two to succeed, they need to get information off each other. So maybe it's an activity where they have to talk to 10 other members of the class and find out some information in order to answer a broader question. That would make it a true cooperative learning activity, because each participant in the group, therefore, can actually contribute. And Barbara, let's have a look at that. I give a specific role to each kid so everyone could do something and feel part of the team. This is a really interesting point, and this is something which comes out much more recently in some of the collaborative learning literature, where you give different roles to different learners. So you can have a group secretary who tends to do the writing, a chairperson who tends to make everyone or to encourage everyone to participate and speak, a timekeeper, and some teachers as well. Quite a fun idea is you can have one roaming member of the group who can go to other groups and steal ideas off them, which can be a fun way to encourage them to interact between groups. And the stealing, that the use of the word steal is kind of provocative, and but the students often can quite enjoy that kind of activity. So definitely, and that's something which I won't be touching on so much today. So thank you, Barbara, for mentioning that. Ursula, small classes, wow, some of us may envy you. I was recently working in classes of 70 students next to a busy road. Yes, and Simon as well. What if one doesn't accept the role you assign? I always hated certain roles when I was put into groups like that, like the role of the timekeeper. Great, you're the timekeeper. And I think that's one of the challenges with creating specific roles. Yeah, and thank you, Ignacia. Students with special needs and learning problems, and also just personalities. It's very much a part of some learners that they want to listen much more than speak. Peer assessment, that's an interesting point. We'll try and come back to that one later as well. Peer assessment is kind of implicit in cooperative learning, and in the book I talk a little bit about that. Yeah, anyway, okay, let's move on. So now that you know a little bit about the two key principles of cooperative learning, have a think about whether there are any activities that you do in your classroom. And there are many activities that we perceive to be kind of central to what we sometimes call communicative language teaching that originate in cooperative learning and that you may be familiar with. So have a think, what activities do you do in your classrooms that would meet those two criteria for cooperative learning? Dialogues? Excuse me. Problem solving, Heike, that's interesting. Pair work and role play. It's interesting that you can do things like role play and dialogue without it necessarily being cooperative. Oh, there was a really long one there that I didn't see. Authentic tasks, asking each other questions, problem solving, creative writing, project work. Project work is really good when you also want to use those roles that we were just discussing. Teamwork with cards to guess and definitions. That's more in the direction. Board games. Board games, again, is quite a good thing in terms of kind of getting everyone to participate if they all have to take a turn. Listening to podcasts and giving a summary. Now, you mentioned they're listening to varied podcasts. So if you've got individual learners to listen to different podcasts, oh, geography. That's interesting. Expert in something on a specific topic. Michael, riddle games. Yes, that would be a very nice idea. I don't know if you saw what Michael said. A riddle games where everybody contributes in order for the riddle to be solved. That would be, by its very definition, a very good example of a cooperative learning activity. And Caitlin, of course, you've got the key kind of principled cooperative learning activity there. I don't know if you can see this, but this is the original book that described cooperative learning. It's called The Jigsaw Classroom, and it's by Elliot Aronson. And Jigsaw is possibly the single biggest cooperative learning activity. Storytelling, Ursula, that's interesting, but how can we make storytelling so that, again, students are all involved, all of them are participating? Creative dialogue, sub-subjects, geography and history. And I'll touch a little bit on those of you who are teaching other subjects for how you can, in fact, in a moment, one key activity, one key cooperative learning activity that will hopefully be useful in your classroom. Story cubes. Oh, I wonder what that is. Okay, songs and stories as well. Can you please show the book again? I'll show it to you at the end, Diana. That's what Dr. Publishing have told me to do in this webinar, so that's an easy one. Great. Okay, chain story. That would be an interesting one as well. Great. So let's now have a look at some of the most kind of common, well-known ones. So these are 5 communicative language teaching activities that have their origins in cooperative learning. Jigsaw reading and listening tasks. Elliot Aronson developed these in the late 1960s, early 1970s in Austin, Texas. Information gap activities, such as you can see the picture there, or it might be an example of describe and draw, which is a type of information gap in itself, where 2 kids in this particular example, one of them is looking at a picture, it seems to be a hippo, and describing it to the other one who's drawing it. And in order for them to succeed, the one who's describing and the one who's drawing have to contribute. Onion ring discussions, I'm not sure if you know what that is, but it's kind of one of those activities where a group of learners stand in an inner circle and another group of learners stand in an outer circle, and they talk to each other and then move around and talk to different people. It was one of those wacky ideas that was there in the 70s and 80s, but doesn't seem to be so common anymore. And find someone who. The people who you saw in the picture where they were standing and mingling earlier in this talk, they were doing a find someone who activity. So they had to actually find a specific person who had done something. And in order for it to work, especially given that in that particular instance, I'd drawn on qualities that everybody in the room had, it worked. So, speed dating, that's an interesting idea. Yeah, that would work. Mosh pitting, Heike, I have no idea what that is. If you can share. Describing a picture together, yes, Maria. That's exactly that kind of describe and draw, as we sometimes call it. Now, these are all examples of communicative language teaching activities that come from cooperative learning. Let's now look at a couple. One of them, just a quick question as well. What was lost when CLT imported these activities? Well, one of the things that I believe, and it's not something I can necessarily prove, is that because communicative language teaching tended to be developed by teachers and teacher educators and methodologists working in classrooms in the UK and the USA, which tended to be multilingual, they tended to be older learners and adults. Often learners were intrinsically motivated, firstly, to speak the language, the target language, because they were all from different backgrounds. So that problem of L1 use didn't arise. And secondly, they were motivated to study, often because they paid for the course personally, or because as older learners, they realized the importance of the course and the objectives that they had for themselves, their ambition, as one of you mentioned. Now, the issue was that at that time, communicative language teaching, therefore, didn't really need the focus on positive interdependence and individual accountability, those 2 principles that I mentioned earlier. And as a result of not needing those principles, they were pretty much lost. And what we ended up with is simply having the activities themselves rather than the principles. So I believe that it's important to kind of hold on to those principles as more and more teachers are working at primary and secondary level teaching English around the world. It's very important that we remember and we kind of re-embrace, reclaim those principles as we go on. So let's have a look at a couple of classic cooperative learning activities. As I mentioned, Elliot Aronson came up with the idea for Jigsaw. I'm sure people were probably doing similar things before them, but he's the first person who researched it and clarified it in its current stage. So the basic idea in Jigsaw is that each student in the group gets a short text or part of a text, and they can't show it to each other, but must summarize the content in order for the group as a whole to complete a task. And I'll show you an example of that in a moment. And the other one that many people won't know so well is something called STAD, or Student Team Achievement Division. Now, if you're teaching CLIL, for example, we've got some geography and history teachers, and one of the kind of main aims of many of your lessons is for learners to learn declarative content knowledge. They might need to learn in geography, for example, about how rivers erode, or in history, they may need to learn about the Second World War. If your aim as a history teacher or a geography teacher is to teach that, and many of us, even as English language teachers, will have presentations as well, for example, of grammar that the students might be tested on in exams, then Robert Slavin's idea for STAD can be really useful. It involves 5 stages and it looks fairly straightforward. Teacher presentation, individual quiz to check learning, and then scores. But the key thing that makes it cooperative is this stage here. Teamwork, in which home groups check that they've all understood the presentation. Now, to show you a way that that could be adopted in communicative language teaching, and an example which is in the book, is, you know, when you're teaching students to tell the time, this is something we tend to do at primary level, but you can probably extrapolate from that to secondary levels. So in the teamwork stage, you can give each group of students a clock, such as this one. Pretty much got the right time, there we go. And they can practice, after you've done a presentation about how to tell the time in English, the students can practice telling the time using their interactive clock, so that the whole group ensures that everybody has learnt the lesson content. That is then followed by an activity, a quiz, which checks that the students have learnt the lesson. And then in order to bring the team back together, the team score is a composite of every individual learner's score in the quiz. And that's a really useful kind of tool, a way of kind of just changing the idea of collaborative learning into something that ensures that the whole group recognize that every member of the group learning the content is necessary for the group itself to win or to be successful, so that the individual scores are brought together. And that's what STAD, or Student Team Achievement Division, is used for. And it seems to be particularly useful in classes where teachers are expected to teach a lot of declarative knowledge to their learners, and the learners are expected obviously to learn it for things like exams. So often in performance-driven educational contexts, like many of us work in today, this can be a useful tool. So there we go. Let's now look at Jigsaw activities. A lot of Jigsaw activities that we find today in textbook and course books are fairly standard things. Let's imagine we've got a 2-text Jigsaw, and you've got, for example, 2 texts about different jobs. So you've got one person, the gist reading task is to guess what someone's job is, and that one happens to be a comedian, and this one is somebody who works in an office as a web designer. And often you see accompanied with the text is general kind of questions where students basically have to regurgitate. They have to just tell each other something that's in the text. So what is her or his job? Where does he or she work? How much does he or she earn? Those questions are not really cooperative, because the issue is that students can tell each other and the other members of the group don't need to listen to each other. So that doesn't mean so that makes it an uncooperative activity, as I called it. Now, in the book itself, the questions that I've got, if you can contrast them, I don't know if you can see them there, are questions that require every group member to contribute to answer the question. So if you have a question like who works hardest, especially if the information is embedded in slightly different ways in the different text. In one text, they may talk about how many hours they work a day. In the other text, they may talk about how many hours they work a week. Then students need to describe and discuss in order to answer that question. So that would be a much more cooperative question. And if you look, you can see something in common amongst all these questions, that they all have, almost all of them have superlatives: most money, well, most difficult job, who is the happiest, and which of the 4 jobs would you prefer, which is kind of a more personalization question as well. By the way, I've got another screen here with the same information if you're wondering where I'm looking. So there we go. There's an important difference between cooperative questions and uncooperative questions. And if you've got a textbook activity in your coursebook where the questions are of the uncooperative type, just try switching those for questions that get them to compare all of the individuals in the text. This text is designed for about B1, B2 level, possibly even A2 level it could work at. And in the actual book itself, there's 4 texts. And you can do it in groups of 4. You can take out one text and do it in groups of 3. And as some of you are saying, if you're finding pair work easier in your classroom, you can just stick to 2 texts and it will work fine as well. So there we go. There's an example of a more cooperative and a less cooperative jigsaw. And you can do similar things to that when you've got a text division jigsaw. Many of us work with longer texts in the classroom. I know many of my colleagues in India do. And when you've got a long text, it can be very difficult to work out, how can I make this lesson interesting? How can I make it communicative? Well, one way is to divide the text into sections, especially if it's a narrative. Some of you mentioned stories. And one of the advantages of this is that you can divide the text into sections, give each learner a different part of the story, and then there is a fairly obvious task that you can give them to ensure that every member of the group contributes and that every member of the group is required to contribute for the group to succeed, making it truly cooperative. Oh, sorry. Someone mentioned, which book was this? Here is the other one. There we go. And so, yeah, let's have a look at a story. This is a story in the book. It's called Gawain's Choice, and it's one of the oldest stories in King Arthur's tale. It's an amazing story, by the way, if you don't know it. If you Google it, you'll find the story and you can create this activity yourself. But imagine that different students have got different stages of the story. And here's a question for you. How could we then make the activity that we ask the students to do truly cooperative? How can we guarantee that every student participates? Any suggestions? What question could we ask them? They've got 3 different parts of the same story. Put the story together, switch over, info, bring them together in the right sequence. Heike, you've got it there. Yeah, to put them in the correct order. So this is the key question that you ask them, what I call a synthesis question. What is the correct order for your 3 extracts? And just so you know, it isn't A first, C is in fact first in this particular story. So there we go. That's the very obvious thing. And this idea of synthesis question, a question that ensures that each member of the group contributes, is a really useful idea to making Jigsaws cooperative. So just to recap, we've looked already at 2 activity types. We've looked at STAD, Student Team Achievement Division, and we've also looked at jigsaw activities, both whole text jigsaws and divided text jigsaw. We've got more ideas coming in. I'll have to move on because of time. Yeah, great. Okay. Let's have a look at discussion activities. Some of you mentioned the word problem solving. Let's imagine, and this is based on a famous city in my country where there was a bit of a discussion about where they should site a new airport. And in fact, the airport hasn't even been granted planning permission. And I've called the city Dunlin. And the idea of the activity was to get learners to work together to decide where to build the new airport. And there were 3 different choices, site A, site B, or option C, to not bother with the airport and to have a rail link instead. So the question here is, how could you then make sure that this discussion activity was also cooperative so that it wasn't dominated by 1 or 2 learners, that everybody had to contribute? Any ideas? Role play, that would be interesting. Yeah, you could get one person to be the kind of the planner. I don't know. Yeah, Lord Mayor. Oh, there we go, Heike. You're thinking faster than me. Residents, locals. I love it. Brilliant. Yeah, a debate. Yeah. All of these are good ideas, and I'm just going to show you what I did in the book. Add an information gap. So you give each student, let's imagine students work in groups of 3 for this one, or maybe they work in 6s and each pair have got a different text. And one pair have got information about option A, one pair have got information about option B, and one pair have got information about option C. So rather than actually taking roles in a kind of debate type thing, they've simply all got a bit more extra information, which will then help them as a group to make a more informed decision, so that they in the group aren't necessarily competing and debating amongst themselves, but that they're working together to come to the best solution for the problem. Creative dialogue among people thinking different. Pros and cons. Thank you, Paola. Yeah. Great. Okay. So lots of ideas, and all of your ideas there I think was really interesting. Heike again, video recording, another brilliant idea. Cool. So there we go. Discussion activity, which is also made cooperative. Now, time-wise, we need to move on a little bit. So just a quick question for you. Which group sizes work best in your classroom? One of you earlier mentioned pairs seem to work better, 3 and 4, 3 to 4. You're all such experienced teachers, 5 there. Yeah. And basically what you've got there is something which is probably distilled through from the cooperative learning literature, that 4 is the magic number when it comes to cooperative learning. Yeah. So let's have a look at why. Well, some of the writers like the Johnson brothers and Spencer Kagan talk about home groups or base groups. And remember, we're talking about different ability classes, very heterogeneous classes. And the most typical format for cooperative learning is these small groups. The groups, especially if you're working in a secondary context, as many of you are, should remain stable, not necessarily for the whole academic year, but at least for one semester or one term. And that each group should have a combination of stronger and weaker learners, so that it's probably better for you as a teacher to decide who goes into each group, so that the students don't pick them themselves and you don't end up with one group which has stronger and one group with weaker learners. And students do the majority of their learning in these 4 to 5 member home groups or base groups. And the advantage of the home group is that they can also break into pairs or one pair and one group of 3 if necessary. Now the maths of that are complex. If your class is larger, you can always create groups of 4 or 5, but you may find that in a smaller class, you also need to create groups of 3. So there we go. Cool. And the Kagan and Kagan book there, by the way, is an interesting and useful reference for that. Now, also, when we do cooperative learning, we sometimes want to move them out of those home groups to create variety. So if you're doing a jigsaw activity, students could start off the day in their home groups, but when they go to read the texts, for example, those texts about the different jobs, they could all move into a different expert group, with the students in group A getting one text about somebody whose job is a comedian. Students in group B get a different text about the graphic designer. And then they come back to their home groups for the jigsaw exchange activity. And the advantage of the expert groups is that it enables students to get together in different groups from their home groups. And you might want to create, for example, one group where the text is more challenging, and then put students who are better at dealing with more challenging texts in that group. Oops, sorry about that. Seems to be a mark on the screen. I'm not sure if that's me or not. Oops, there we go. Yeah. Oh yeah, I'll just leave it there. I don't know if you can see, but there's a line on a red line come onto my screen. Yeah, there we go. So home groups and expert groups. And of course, individual and pair work, as we all know, are necessarily important in all classes. And it's important that we don't forget that some students also really need that opportunity to work individually, sometimes to read texts, sometimes quiet time to practice activities, and for assessment purposes. Great. Okay, cool. So there we go. That's what some of the cooperative learning literature says, but it looks like most of you pretty much already knew all of that. One thing that it doesn't recommend is groups of 6 or more. And the reason for this is this very often mentioned point that some of the students tend to become too passive and they don't participate. And one way of making them participate in larger groups is the idea that one of you mentioned earlier about giving the learners different roles in the group. And that can ensure that everybody participates, but it's always difficult to think of more than 5 or 6 roles, because you tend to end up with these kind of rather not very useful roles like timekeeper or language police or something like this, which for me personally I wouldn't enjoy doing. So there we go, groups in cooperative learning. Now, research evidence. I promised to cover some of the research evidence on cooperative learning, and so I'm just going to try to get rid of that red line. It's starting to annoy me a little bit. Annotate, eraser. So we can get rid of, yes, there we go, good. Okay, so let's have a look at the research on cooperative learning. Well, there have been a large number of studies conducted on cooperative learning. Johnson & Johnson mentioned over 1,200, and John Hattie supports this as well. In the meta-analyses by Hattie and Marzano, there is fairly universal agreement that cooperative learning is effective. But interestingly, there is evidence as well that in some contexts it doesn't work. So it's important to remember that point I mentioned earlier about always being critical yourself. The effect size they're talking about is the difference in learning between groups who do cooperative learning and groups who don't do it. And because these are meta-analyses, they're bringing together the ideas from different studies. But just to give you an idea, a Cohen's D, the actual effect size that they're describing there of 0.5 can increase learning by several months over the course of a year. There is also some anecdotal report of it working in more challenging contexts, large class contexts in China, and also Panwar's study, I think, is in Pakistan or Afghanistan as well. And it's important to remember that over 90% of the studies that show this evidence come from the USA. So there's not enough research conducted in other contexts. Svetlana, your camera has come on. If you can switch that off, thank you. So there we go. That's the research evidence supporting cooperative learning. So hopefully this has been a useful kind of tour of some of the ideas of cooperative learning and some of the ideas in the book. And I'll come back to it right now because I just want to take a moment as well to discuss the book itself and the series that it comes from, what we call the Delta Publishing Ideas in Action series. Well, the titles in this series aim to bring together the theory and practice of specific approaches, methods, or principles. And cooperative learning was the first title in this series, but at the same time, two other really good authors, Neil Anderson and Neil McCutcheon, also produced a book called Activities for Task-Based Learning. And in both of these books, we look at some of the theory behind these approaches. You probably have heard lots of about task-based learning as well. And we look at ways to make them work in the classroom. And to show you a little bit from inside the current book, Activities for Cooperative Learning, here is the, you may not be able to see this. If you can screenshot it, you can look at it later. But I'll zoom into one of these pages in a moment. These are the contents pages of my book. And as well as having an introduction to the approach that we're talking about, and you'll see these in the contents pages of all the ideas in action books, they also include things like micro strategies and tools, including things like random nomination. The other book, okay, yes, well, I'll come back to that other book in a moment. STEM analysis in the micro strategies, and there's also lots of different ideas for how you can use things like Padlet to make lessons more cooperative if you have access to that, and simple activities such as pass the pen that ensure that every learner contributes, think, pair, share, which is one of the classics of cooperative learning and so important when we're teaching declarative knowledge. And you can see there are about 8 different sections there, including whole class jigsaws, jigsaw activities, teamwork activities, pair work, group work activities, reciprocal reading, STAD activities, find someone who or find everyone who, and also activities which encourage use of the mother tongue as well as English. Gadjan, your camera is on there. If you can switch off your camera, that would be great. Nice to see you, by the way, Gadjan. Hope everything's fine. Great, so there we go. So somebody mentioned the other book. We're running out of time, so here we go. Here's the other book that's already published, Activities for Task-Based Learning by Neil Anderson and Neil McCutcheon. And both of the books have a similar format, and you'll find that if you learn how to use one of them, you can use the other. One thing I forgot to mention as well is that as well as having kind of an introduction to the activity, on a double-page spread, you will see that there is the introduction to the general activity type and then the instructions for an example activity of that. So you can use the ideas here to create your own activities, adapt it to your own context. And you'll see that in both the books as well. So there we go. So those are the 2 books which are already out, and 2 books which are in the pipeline, which we're excited about, are Activities for Alternative Assessment. I won't say too much about that now, and Activities for Inclusive Language Teaching. And some amazing activities in both of those books I can also see. Ellie, about the PPT, I'll share it with Martin at Delta, and he will probably do something there. Okay, great. Thank you very much. Right, so there we go. I've run over a little bit, but let's find out if you guys have any. There's some references. I may not have mentioned all of those, but if you're interested in some of the literature, the research, you can see it there. And some of these books, like Aronson's Jigsaw Classroom, you can often pick it up quite cheaply on Amazon nowadays because there's lots of copies floating around. And the Johnson Brothers research there as well, you can see. And Spencer Kagan's book, Kagan and Kagan Cooperative Learning. That's a really, really useful book as well, I would say personally. So there we go. Carol, are the books aimed at teens or adults? Good question. Activities for Cooperative Learning is aimed, I would say, at both age groups, but with a focus on the challenges of teachers working with teen learners, because cooperative learning is, I think, well suited to that context. It was devised within secondary and primary classrooms, mainly secondary, in fact. Excuse me. And as a result, it's a really useful set of approaches for the teen classroom. So it's designed more for the teen classroom, but the activities will work in adult classrooms as well. You'll just find that they're considering all the challenges we face in teen classrooms. Diana, can we buy them online? You can buy the books online. There aren't PDF or ebook versions available, as far as I know, at least at this stage. But Martin will chip in if I'm wrong about that. Thanks a lot for everyone for coming. Where can we buy them? Well, you can buy them through the Delta Publishing website. There we go, Martin has got it there. The Delta Publishing website. And you can also buy them on different Amazons. I'm not sure if I should say that, Martin, but great. Any more questions? Any more contributions as well in terms of something for not very, yes, certificate for attendance, Martin will cover that. Lydia, cooperative learning, good for not very strong classes. Yes, it is. But you have to create materials which are appropriate to the learners. So for example, in terms of an information gap for a low level classroom, you can simply give the learners an activity where they have a spreadsheet or kind of a graph, and they have to find out certain details of every member in the classroom by asking questions like, what is your name? Where do you come from? And so on. You need to adapt the activities. Thank you, Ignacia. And that is something which I always encourage. The book itself is designed about not just adapting, but creating your own activities. Can be used with teachers as well, yeah, for professional development, for giving them ideas. Yeah, great, thank you. Any grid to evaluate cooperative learning? Wow, you've again predicted something in the book. So on page 17 of the book, there is a specific activity here which, if your learners aren't used to cooperative learning, you can use this pro forma, this photocopyable sheet, give it to the students at the start of the year, and at different stages they can self-assess, followed by the teacher assessment of how well they're doing things in a cooperative classroom, such as, are you polite and friendly to your classmates and the teacher? And they have to rate it from, I'm not good at this yet, to I'm excellent at this. And things like listening to your classmates are there, so that we train the learners in more cooperative ways of working. And this is something that works really well in primary classrooms and lower secondary as well, but even upper secondary it will work well. Not so necessary at adult level, but even adult learners, students who aren't used to working cooperatively can benefit from that as well. The materials of this meeting, the PPT again, yeah, we will share that. Great. Anything I went through too quickly that, or any questions you had at the start that haven't been answered? And is anybody disappointed? Is there somebody there going, I knew all of this already? If you are, then you should be writing books, not me. Do activities cover all levels? Good question. There's a question there for Josepha to Martin. What was that? To unmute. Okay, Josepha, can you unmute Martin, please? Josepha is our person in charge of the technical side. So in terms of the level of the activities, let me just show you there. The levels of the activities go from A1 to B2, but they'll also go, they're mainly at the A2 to B2 level. That's where cooperative learning activities tend to work. And because the book encourages you to create your own activities, the level range is quite broad. So for some of the activity types, the level 1 range goes from A1 to B2. A1, by the way, is a lower elementary level, and B2 is upper intermediate level, about at the level for the Cambridge First Certificate or an IELTS 7. Is there anything like cooperative teaching? Yeah, collaborative learning is like it, but it doesn't have the principles as we were discussing earlier. And adapting it to higher levels, yes, most definitely. I've used it in business classrooms with C1, C2 level learners. Brilliant. Monica, you remember studying Kagan. Great.
Wow.
Welcome back, Martin.
Hello there.